The morning sun cast long shadows across the entrance of Fort as Colonel Sarah Mitchell approached the main gate in her civilian clothes. She had been driving for 6 hours straight from Washington, D.C., summoned urgently to handle a classified situation that required her immediate attention. Her military uniform was packed in her overnight bag, as she hadn't had time to change before leaving the capital. Sarah was not just any ordinary officer. At 42 years old, she held one of the most prestigious positions in military intelligence, serving as the Director of Strategic Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Her clearance level was so high that only a handful of people in the entire country knew the full extent of her responsibilities. She had spent the last 15 years climbing the ranks through exceptional service, including 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, where she had earned numerous commendations for her strategic brilliance and leadership under fire. The young guard at the entrance, Private Tommy Harrison, was only 21 years old and had been stationed at Fort for just 3 months. This was his first assignment after completing basic training, and he was eager to prove himself as a reliable soldier. Tommy had been specifically trained to follow protocol to the letter, especially when it came to base security. His superiors had repeatedly emphasized that no exceptions should be made, regardless of who claimed to have authorization. As Sarah pulled up to the checkpoint in her silver sedan, she rolled down the window and reached for her military identification. The morning was already growing warm, and she was tired from the long drive. She had been working nonstop for the past week on a sensitive operation that involved coordinating with multiple international allies, and this emergency call had interrupted what was supposed to be her first weekend off in months. "Good morning, I'm Colonel Sarah Mitchell. I need to access the base immediately," she said, extending her military ID toward the guard booth. Private Harrison looked at the identification card carefully, then back at Sarah. Something seemed off to him. The woman in front of him looked nothing like what he expected a colonel to look like. She was wearing a simple blue blouse and jeans, her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she appeared tired and somewhat disheveled from the long journey. In his limited experience, all the high-ranking officers he had encountered were always in crisp uniforms, perfectly groomed, and arrived in official military vehicles. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Tommy said, his voice betraying his nervousness despite his attempt to sound authoritative. Sarah was surprised by the request, but assuming it was standard procedure she wasn't familiar with at this particular base. As she stood beside her car, Tommy examined her ID more closely, turning it over in his hands multiple times. The morning traffic was beginning to build up behind Sarah's vehicle, with other personnel arriving for their shifts. "Is there a problem with my identification?" Sarah asked, glancing at her watch. She was already running late for a meeting with the base commander, General Roberts, who was expecting her to brief him on a time-sensitive intelligence matter that could not be delayed. Tommy had been taught to look for signs of fraudulent identification, and several things were raising red flags in his mind. The ID appeared legitimate, but he had never seen such a high-ranking female officer, especially one who looked so young and was dressed so casually. His training instructor had warned him about sophisticated fake IDs and had emphasized that enemies of the state would go to great lengths to infiltrate military installations. "Ma'am, I'm not able to verify this identification. The system isn't showing you as having authorization to enter this base," Tommy said, though in reality, he hadn't even attempted to run her ID through the verification system. His nervousness was getting the better of him, and he was making assumptions based on his limited experience. Sarah felt a wave of frustration wash over her. She had been in the military long enough to understand the importance of security protocols, but she also knew that time was of the essence. The intelligence she carried could potentially save lives, and every minute of delay could have serious consequences. "Private, please run my ID through your system again. I assure you that I have the highest level of clearance," Sarah said, trying to maintain her patience while also conveying the urgency of the situation. But Tommy had already made up his mind. In his inexperience, he had convinced himself that this was exactly the kind of situation his instructors had warned him about. Someone was trying to use a fake ID to gain access to a secure military installation, and it was his duty to prevent it. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. This identification appears to be fraudulent, and I cannot allow you to enter the base," Tommy announced, his voice growing more confident as he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. The line of vehicles behind Sarah was now extending down the road, with frustrated personnel honking their horns and checking their watches. Several other guards from nearby posts had noticed the commotion and were beginning to take interest in what was happening at the main gate. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. In all her years of service, she had never encountered such a situation. She realized that the young guard was genuinely convinced he was doing his job, but his inexperience was creating a serious problem that could have far-reaching consequences. "Private, I need you to contact your superior officer immediately. This is a matter of national security, and I need to speak with someone who can verify my credentials properly," Sarah said, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone despite her civilian clothes. Tommy, however, interpreted her insistence as further evidence that she was not who she claimed to be. In his mind, a real colonel would simply comply with his instructions and leave the base, rather than continuing to argue and make demands. "Ma'am, I've made my decision. Please return to your vehicle and leave the area immediately, or I will be forced to call for backup and have you removed," Tommy said, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. Sarah realized that the situation was escalating beyond what either of them had intended. She knew that if backup arrived and found her in this confrontation, it could create an even bigger scene and potentially compromise the sensitive nature of her mission. At the same time, she couldn't simply leave without accessing the base, as lives could literally depend on the intelligence she needed to deliver. The morning sun was climbing higher, and the heat was beginning to make everyone more uncomfortable. Other personnel in the growing line of vehicles were starting to get out of their cars to see what was causing the delay, and Sarah knew that the situation was about to become even more complicated. As the standoff at the gate continued, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her secure satellite phone, a device that only the highest-ranking military officials possessed. The phone was equipped with encryption technology that allowed for direct communication with Pentagon officials and other key military leaders around the world. "I'm going to make one phone call, and then this situation will be resolved," Sarah told Tommy, who was now looking increasingly uncertain about his decision but was too proud to back down. Sarah dialed a number that connected her directly to the office of General William, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General had been her mentor for over a decade and was one of the few people who knew the full scope of her current mission. The phone rang twice before his aide answered. "This is Colonel Mitchell. I need to speak with General immediately. I'm currently being detained at Fort, and I need immediate assistance to verify my credentials," Sarah said in a calm but urgent tone. Within 30 seconds, General was on the line. Sarah quickly explained the situation, speaking in coded language that Tommy couldn't understand, but which conveyed the critical nature of her mission to the general. "Colonel, I'll handle this immediately. Give me 5 minutes," General said before ending the call. What happened next would become legendary in military circles for years to come. General immediately contacted 4 other high-ranking generals who were involved in Sarah's classified operation. Within minutes, a coordinated response was initiated that would demonstrate just how critical Sarah's mission really was. The first call went to General Stone, the base commander at Fort, who was in her office reviewing reports when her secure line rang. When General explained the situation, General Stone's face went pale. She immediately ordered her aide to prepare her vehicle and rushed toward the main gate, her heart racing as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. The second call reached General, who was at the Pentagon in a meeting with intelligence officials from 3 different agencies. He excused himself from the meeting and immediately began making arrangements to fly to Fort, understanding that Sarah's detention could compromise an operation that had taken months to plan. General, the third general contacted, was at a NATO summit in Brussels when he received the call. Despite being in the middle of crucial international negotiations, he stepped out to coordinate with his American colleagues, ensuring that the international aspects of Sarah's mission could continue without interruption. The fourth general, David, was actually retired, but maintained the highest security clearances due to his ongoing consulting work on sensitive projects. He was at his home in Virginia when the call came, and he immediately began making phone calls to various contacts to ensure that Sarah's situation was resolved quickly and quietly. Meanwhile, at the gate, Tommy was becoming increasingly nervous as he watched Sarah on her phone. He had never seen a communication device like the one she was using, and her confident demeanor was starting to make him question his initial judgment. Other guards were beginning to gather around, sensing that something unusual was happening. Sergeant Mike Foster, Tommy's immediate supervisor, arrived at the scene just as Sarah was finishing her phone call. Foster had been in the military for 12 years and had never seen a situation quite like this one. He quickly assessed what was happening and realized that Tommy might have made a serious error in judgment. "Private Harrison, what exactly is the situation here?" Sergeant Foster asked, his experienced eye immediately noticing details that Tommy had missed. He saw the sophisticated communication device, the confident way Sarah carried herself despite being out of uniform, and the high-quality materials of her civilian clothes that suggested someone of significant means and position. "Sergeant, this woman is trying to gain access to the base with what appears to be fraudulent identification. She claims to be a colonel, but she doesn't look like any colonel I've ever seen," Tommy explained, still convinced he was doing the right thing despite his growing uncertainty. Foster examined Sarah's identification more carefully than Tommy had, and his years of experience immediately told him that the ID was not only genuine, but indicated someone of extraordinary importance. The security features, the clearance codes, and the quality of the documentation were far beyond anything a civilian could obtain illegally. "Ma'am, I apologize for any inconvenience. Let me run this through our verification system properly," Foster said, but before he could take any action, the sound of approaching vehicles caught everyone's attention. 3 military vehicles were racing toward the gate at high speed, their emergency lights flashing. The first vehicle contained General Stone and her security detail, followed by 2 additional cars carrying other high-ranking base personnel who had been hastily summoned to deal with the situation. As the vehicles screeched to a halt near the gate, Tommy's face went white. He had never seen so many high-ranking officials respond to a single incident, and he began to realize that he might have made the biggest mistake of his young military career. General Stone emerged from her vehicle with an expression of barely controlled urgency and concern. She was an imposing woman in her 50s, with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that had earned her respect throughout the military. She had commanded troops in some of the most challenging situations the military had faced in recent years, and her reputation for competence was legendary. "Colonel Mitchell, I sincerely apologize for this delay," General Stone said as she approached Sarah, her tone respectful but also conveying the seriousness of the situation. "We need to get you to the briefing room immediately." The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Tommy watched in stunned silence as the base commander, someone he had only seen from a distance during formal ceremonies, treated the woman he had been detaining as a respected colleague and superior officer. But the surprises weren't over. As General Stone was speaking with Sarah, 2 more military aircraft could be heard approaching the base. These were not ordinary flights, but specially authorized aircraft bringing additional high-ranking officials who needed to be present for Sarah's briefing. Major Collins, General Stone's aide, quickly approached the group with a tablet computer that showed real-time updates on the situation. "General, we have confirmation that General's aircraft will be landing in 15 minutes, and General is joining the briefing via secure video conference from Brussels." The gravity of what Tommy had unknowingly interfered with was beginning to dawn on everyone present. This was not simply a matter of one officer trying to access a base. It was a situation involving multiple generals, international coordination, and what was clearly a matter of the highest national security importance. Sarah, despite her frustration with the delay, maintained her professionalism and focus on the mission at hand. She knew that every minute counted, and while the situation at the gate had been resolved, the real work was just beginning. "General Stone, we need to proceed immediately. The intelligence I'm carrying has time-sensitive implications, and our window for action is narrowing," Sarah said, gathering her belongings and preparing to leave the gate area. As the group prepared to move toward the base headquarters, Tommy stood frozen in place, still processing what had just unfolded before his eyes. Sergeant Foster placed a hand on his shoulder, understanding the shock and embarrassment the young soldier was experiencing. As the convoy of military vehicles sped toward the base headquarters, Tommy remained at the gate, his mind reeling from what had just transpired. Sergeant Foster stayed behind to help him process the situation, and to ensure that the gate operations continued normally despite the extraordinary events that had just unfolded. "Son, do you understand what just happened here?" Sergeant Foster asked gently, recognizing that Tommy was experiencing a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and confusion. Tommy could barely speak. In the span of just a few minutes, he had gone from believing he was protecting the base from a potential security threat to realizing he had detained one of the most important military officials in the country. The woman he had refused entry to had just been escorted away by 5 generals, and military aircraft were landing specifically to support her mission. "Sergeant, how was I supposed to know? She looked so normal," Tommy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Foster nodded understandingly. "That's exactly the point, Private. Colonel Mitchell is what we call a gray person in intelligence circles. The most effective intelligence officers are those who can blend in anywhere, who don't draw attention to themselves. Her ability to look ordinary is actually one of her greatest professional assets." Meanwhile, in the secure briefing room at base headquarters, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. General Stone had quickly assembled the necessary personnel and equipment to support Sarah's mission briefing. The room was equipped with the most advanced communication technology available, allowing for real-time coordination with officials around the world. Sarah had finally changed into her military uniform, and the transformation was remarkable. In her dress blues with full decorations, she looked every inch the distinguished colonel that she was. Her ribbons told the story of a remarkable career. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, multiple Purple Hearts, and numerous campaign medals from operations around the world. General's aircraft had landed, and he entered the briefing room with his usual decisive manner. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s who had earned his reputation through successful leadership in some of the military's most challenging operations. His presence immediately added weight to the proceedings. "Colonel Mitchell, I trust the situation at the gate has been resolved satisfactorily," General said as he took his seat at the conference table. "Yes, sir. Let's proceed with the briefing," Sarah replied, activating the secure communication systems that would connect them with General in Brussels and other key officials around the world. The intelligence that Sarah had traveled so urgently to deliver was indeed extraordinary. She had uncovered a sophisticated international network that was planning coordinated attacks on military installations across 3 continents. The information had been gathered through months of careful surveillance and infiltration work by agents operating under her direction. "We have a narrow window of opportunity to prevent these attacks," Sarah began, displaying classified satellite imagery and intelligence reports on the large screens around the room. "The network has accelerated their timeline, and we believe they intend to move within the next 48 hours. The room fell silent as the full scope of the threat became clear. The planned attacks were far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had previously imagined, involving coordinated strikes that could have resulted in hundreds of casualties and compromised military operations around the world. General, appearing via secure video link from Brussels, was the first to speak. "Colonel, the European Command is prepared to coordinate our response with your recommendations. What do you need from our end?" For the next 3 hours, Sarah led a complex planning session that involved coordinating resources across multiple time zones and military commands. Her expertise and leadership were evident as she guided the discussion, assigned responsibilities, and ensured that every aspect of the response was carefully planned and coordinated. General, who had arrived by helicopter an hour into the briefing, contributed his specialized knowledge of the terrorist networks involved. His years of experience in counterintelligence operations proved invaluable as the group developed strategies to neutralize the threats. The meeting demonstrated why Sarah held such a critical position in military intelligence. Her ability to synthesize complex information, coordinate international responses, and maintain focus under pressure was extraordinary. The generals around the table, each accomplished leaders in their own right, deferred to her expertise and followed her recommendations. Back at the gate, word of what had happened was spreading quickly throughout the base. Soldiers who heard the story were amazed by the dramatic turn of events, and Tommy found himself at the center of attention in a way he had never expected or wanted. Colonel Martinez, the base security chief, arrived at the gate to conduct a review of the incident. He was a stern but fair officer who understood the importance of learning from mistakes rather than simply punishing them. Private Harrison, I want you to understand that while your intentions were good, this incident highlights the need for better training and procedures, Colonel Martinez said. However, I also want you to know that Colonel Mitchell herself has requested that no disciplinary action be taken against you. Tommy was surprised and relieved to hear this. He had expected to face serious consequences for his mistake, and the fact that the colonel he had detained was showing such understanding and professionalism made him feel even more ashamed of his error in judgment. "Sir, I'd like to apologize to Colonel Mitchell personally when she's available," Tommy said. "That may be arranged, but understand that the colonel is currently involved in operations that are vital to national security. Her time is extremely valuable," Colonel Martinez replied. The security review that followed the incident led to important changes in base procedures. New training protocols were implemented to help guards better identify legitimate high-ranking officials who might arrive out of uniform or in unusual circumstances. The incident became a case study used in military security training programs across the country. 3 days later, news began to emerge of successful military operations that had prevented the planned terrorist attacks that Sarah had warned about. While the full details remained classified, it was clear that her urgent mission to Fort had been instrumental in coordinating the response that saved countless lives. Sarah herself remained characteristically humble about her role in the success. When she finally had a few minutes to speak with Tommy before leaving the base, she was gracious and understanding. "Private, I want you to know that your dedication to following security procedures, even when it was inconvenient for me, shows that you take your responsibilities seriously," she told him. "That's exactly the kind of attitude we need in our soldiers. Just remember that sometimes the most important people are the ones who don't look important." Tommy never forgot that lesson. He went on to have a distinguished military career, eventually becoming a security specialist himself. He often told the story of the day he refused entry to one of the most important military officers in the country, and how that mistake taught him valuable lessons about judgment, humility, and the complexity of military service. The incident at Fort became part of military folklore, a story told in academies and training programs as an example of how quickly situations can change in military service, and how the most ordinary-looking people sometimes carry the greatest responsibilities. For Sarah, it was just another day in a career dedicated to protecting her country. But for Tommy and many others, it was a defining moment that shaped their understanding of service, sacrifice, and the extraordinary people who work behind the scenes to keep the nation safe. Years later, when Tommy had been promoted to sergeant and was training new recruits himself, he would always emphasize the importance of thorough verification procedures, while also teaching them to recognize that true authority doesn't always come in the expected package. The story of Colonel Sarah Mitchell and the day 5 generals rushed to her assistance became a powerful reminder that in military service, assumptions can be dangerous, and the most important missions often depend on people who prefer to remain invisible.